Your Sunday morning will never be the same. The wake-up call moves to KSJE. Local guests, great music and conversation, Sundays at 11 a.m. on KSJE, Farmington. Ten minutes past 8 o'clock. It's Thursday morning, the 5th day of September, 2024. Good morning, everyone. I'm Scott Micklin. Thanks for tuning in to KSJE, 90.9 FM over the air, of course, here in San Juan County, New Mexico. In Durango, Colorado, we broadcast all the time up there at 103.3 FM. And if you're anywhere else on Earth and want to tune in and hear what we're up to, just go to our website to listen, streaming all the time from ksje.com. Also want to welcome our viewers who are joining us this morning. The video of this program is streaming out live to the KSJE Facebook page and also to our YouTube channel. So lots of ways for you to join us this morning, and so glad that you are with us. Coming up in the next few moments, my guest, archaeologist Paul Reed, will be here with our regular discussion. This month we are talking about careers in archaeology. It's worked out pretty good for Paul, so he'll share some advice about that coming up in the next few moments right here on KSJE this morning. Then later on this hour, we'll be checking in with our friends from the San Juan Medical Foundation because it's that time again. The 44th Annual Cancer Walkathon will be happening in Farmington in just a few weeks. We'll get the details and pass them along to you today at 8:50 a.m. right here on KSJE. Then, of course, Mick Hess will take over the airwaves. He'll take us roving with the arts, our weekday classical music program, sharing all kinds of arts events and other things that are going on. That's coming your way next hour here on KSJE as well. Don't forget, you can also connect with us on X and Instagram in addition to Facebook and YouTube. And if you're a podcast person, we invite you to subscribe for free to KSJE podcasts. They are available places where you're already listening to podcasts. So check it out and maybe discover a new local program that you may have missed recently. Outside our studios here at San Juan College, it is a mostly sunny Thursday morning, 62 degrees at the moment, humidity 43%, and we are expecting a mostly sunny day today. In fact, take a look at that forecast. Sunshine for the next 10 days. Today's high, 86 in Farmington, 60 degrees overnight tonight, sunny and 82 tomorrow. It'll be 84 on Saturday, 85 on Sunday. Mid-80s again for much of next week with overnight lows right around 60 degrees. I'll be back with my guest, Paul Reed, in just a moment right here on KSJE. KSJE is supported by San Juan Regional Medical Center. The caregivers of San Juan Regional Medical Center are committed to bettering the quality of life, health, and care of individuals, families, and our communities. Life is their sacred trust. Better is their mission. Here is their home. San Juan Regional Medical Center, improving the health of the Four Corners since 1910.
KSJE is proud to support the San Juan Symphony and their 39th season, Radiant Echoes. The season kicks off with modern classical style. 7:30 p.m. Saturday, October 12th at the Community Concert Hall at Fort Lewis College in Durango, and 3 p.m. Sunday, October 13th at the Henderson Fine Arts Performance Hall at San Juan College in Farmington. Find out more about the San Juan Symphony at sanjuansymphony.org. KSJE is proud to support the 2024 Four Corners Film Festival, sponsored by San Juan County. The event is September 12th, 13th, and 14th at the historic Tota Theater in the heart of downtown Farmington. See on the big screen some of the best and brightest filmmakers from the Southwest and Sundance Institute short films, as well as one familiar favorite. Tickets and more information are online at film4corners.org. The 2024 Four Corners Film Festival, September 12th, 13th, and 14th. KSJE is proud to support the Aztec Museum in Pioneer Village, featuring their free Smithsonian event on Saturday, September 21st. In addition to free admission, a kids' craft activity, and a demonstration of the vintage newspaper printing press, a special panel discussion will take place at 2 p.m. about the lost communities of Navajo Dam. The Aztec Museum in Pioneer Village is located at 125 North Main in Aztec. Find out more at aztecmuseum.org.
And back in Studio A this morning with my guest, who is joining us remotely, of course. Paul Reed is here once again for his regular visit with me. Always great to have him on the program. Paul, good morning.
Good morning, Scott. Glad to be back on with you.
Thank you for being here. And as I mentioned, our topic today is kind of careers in archaeology or jobs in archaeology. And you have been in this profession for, I don't know, how more years than maybe you want to admit. I don't know if you count them all up.
I hit the big 4-0 for actually getting paid to do some kind of archaeological or cultural work. So
how about that? Very good. Well, congratulations. That is a long commitment, but again, you're very good at what you do, so I'm not surprised that you would have hit the big 4-0. And a number of those years you've been on the air with me, so almost half of them, I would think. So, yikes. How about that?
Yeah. I think we've been having our little pleasant chats here for quite a bit. So
indeed.
Yeah.
I
always appreciate the opportunity.
Well, the feeling's mutual. And so the career obviously has worked out well for you, and you have a passion for it. And I think that's one of the things that is that happens in careers, I think, like broadcasting and teaching and archaeology and things like that. If for individuals that have a passion for it, it doesn't feel like you're going to work every day. And I imagine that's maybe how you feel, but I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Yeah, definitely. And it's kind of one of those things that I sit here and kind of look back now, and I'm like, wow, this seemed to go slow at times, but very quickly. So, but yeah, I think that for all of us, what maybe helps us find that passion and that zeal for doing it is feeling like we're having impact, we're making some kind of difference. So that definitely is how it feels for me.
Sure. Well, and again, that's very, very true. And we've talked about some of those impacts that you have made in your organization that you work for, and others in your field have made as well during our conversations. And so that's been great. So you shared with me a blog post. It's a little dated, but it's from about, 11 years ago, about just this topic that we're talking about. And it looks like one of your colleagues has put together maybe some data on the jobs in different areas. Again, it kind of busts the myth that archaeologists just work for museums and things along that line, which I thought was really interesting to kind of detail some of the different areas that hire archaeologists and that folks can work in. And so that was really interesting to me. I'll share that in just a moment.
Yeah, and this is, I don't know, it's kind of a mixed bag, we might say, because a lot of times if I'm talking to folks or my friends or colleagues are, and they say, hey, we're archaeologists, people get very excited, which is wonderful. But then they generally go in a couple of directions, right? They're like, oh, so how many times have you been to Egypt? And one of my shames as an archaeologist is I've never been to Egypt. Fortunately, retirement's on the path here sooner or later, so I might be able to get over there. But because of course the popularity of Indiana Jones and Lara Croft, the Tomb Raider, there is this notion that archaeologists generally go to foreign lands, and especially if we're looking at a model that's 100-ish years, some cases not even that old, they're going into foreign places, begging, borrowing, cajoling their way in, and then they're stealing artifacts from those places and coming back to one or more museums. And unfortunately, as we've talked, Scott, this was the pattern. This has been described as the collection phase of American and kind of Western archaeology. So fortunately, we passed through that. I think that's good news in general. So what I try to do, and I think what some of my friends and colleagues try to do, is we get a little bounce from the idea that, hey, archaeology is this really cool thing. And then, if we have time to do more than the 30-second the waves settle a bit, and it's like, yeah, that's, there are different jobs, but most archaeologists don't have lives that are quite that exciting.
Got it. Understood. Well, and that makes sense, and I can see from the media, its influence on folks who see some of these things. You mentioned the R word, and I really don't want to entertain that thought, Paul Reed, but it's out there, so we'll just leave that there, and I appreciate that. But when we look at some,
right, we should probably have a rule on our shows just to
yeah.
No R word.
No,
So,
well, you can mention it all you want, but that's all right. But anyway, as we look at some of the data that you shared from this blog again, and this is a colleague, as I mentioned, there are some sources that are cited in this blog, so this is where the information is coming from. And would you say it's still fairly accurate when we look at these totals of archaeologists, or have the numbers shifted just a little bit? I would assume they've gotten maybe a little bit larger in 11 years.
yeah, I think they're up from here. So this individual, his name, his name right, it's Rox McQueen, and Doug has this WordPress blog and has done a lot of good public sort of promotion of archaeology. What he came up with in 2014 was roughly 11,000 or so different individuals employed in archaeology. I'm guessing, looking at a couple more recent things that weren't as comprehensive as what Doug put together, that were probably between 13 and 15,000, and those are pretty well distributed. There are academic folks, 1,500 to 2,000. There's federal folks who work as archaeologists for Park Service, for Forest Service, for BLM, for Bureau of Reclamation, all these different agencies. 1,500 to 2,000. The states employ just under 1,000 archaeologists. In sort of the cultural resource management, private sector, or contract world, that's really where the bulk of folks are at. In '08, and again, that's even a little older, there was tracked to be about 7,000. So I think that number is probably up fairly significantly, probably over 10,000. So there are archaeologists working in these different sectors. The other thing that Doug wasn't tracking, and we would definitely do that today, is archaeologists working with tribal groups, and that's
Sure.
It's not in the thousands, but I imagine, we're
Oh, we seem to have lost Paul's audio feed there for just a moment. It's been kind of cutting in and out this morning, but we're hoping that he will reconnect in just a moment as we talk about the number of archaeology jobs across the country and in the different areas. Of course, where folks are working. And as Paul mentioned, he has had a 40-year career in archaeology. He has worked a lot here in this area, Salmon Ruins and Aztec Ruins, Chaco Canyon, and a lot of other sites in this area, and published his work. And he works for Archaeology Southwest, which is based in Tucson, does a lot of work throughout the Southwest. Paul is actually now based in the Taos area of New Mexico, and I'm waiting for Paul to reconnect here. We'll see if he is able to do that in just a moment here on KSJE this morning. But it certainly is, again, a rewarding career for folks who are interested, and we'll ask him a little bit more about maybe advice for students who might want to follow this career path, because, again, it is one of those careers that, if you have a passion for it, you can definitely do very good. So let's see if we can get back to Paul and see if he's able to join us. Not seeing him reconnect, so let me send him a message here. And we'll see if we can't get the show back on the road, as they say. So stand by, everybody. We will figure that out in just a moment. But as he mentioned, again, from this blog post from about 11 years ago, the breakdown of some of the archaeology jobs in the United States, and that would, of course, be academic and federal and state, and the cultural rights management jobs, and the total being from about 11,000, or give or take. Again, those numbers have gone up probably a little bit since this published. And again, there's a lot more other folks who are working with tribal groups, which has been one of the things that Paul and I have talked about several times on this program, is the work that Archaeology Southwest and others are making with tribal groups, again, as they kind of make those overtures and study more of those really significant areas that are very significant to these tribal groups and culturally significant, and the need to be respectful, and also being able to work with them and organize things with those groups. So let's see if Paul is with us here. I think that he is. Paul, are you there? On the phone.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah. Can you hear me?
We can. Yes, we can. Does it sound any better? We were having issues with the sound, but looks like you are back on video as well. So let's try that.
Okay, sure.
Or what do you?
Okay,
Sorry,
be back.
I was just vamping a little bit.
Not sure what's going on, but
That's all right. It's live radio and technology, and so that's what happens. But I was talking a bit with the audience about the group that you mentioned about these archaeologists working with tribal groups, and that's something you and I have talked about on this program. And I think that's a really important new group of archaeologists that have been kind of growing recently, don't you?
definitely is, Scott. And there's a number of tribal members who've gone through programs, certainly since Doug put this work together, a decade plus ago, who've then joined their own tribe in different positions, tribal historic preservation positions, archaeological staff positions. And then there's a few non-tribal members who work either as the tribal historic preservation folks or do different aspects of the work. So I think that's a significant part of this that we're not seeing on here. But, kind of the point of this is that there is a diversity of careers in the field of archaeology. And, if you're looking at it from kind of a strictly academic point of view, you can see with the numbers compiled that it really isn't that high of a percentage of, if we're going to say there's 15,000, then it's probably no more than 20%, if even that high, of folks who work in traditional academic settings as, an Indiana Jones type, or, just someone who's a professor and is teaching classes and then does field work when it works out. So I think that really speaks to the diversity of the field and the way that folks who go through different university programs kind of learn how to manage cultural resources in all these different ways. And, even before some of the changing ethical background that we've talked about, where, we want to work closely with tribes, we don't want to just go out and dig sites because that's what archaeologists have always done. Even before some of that awakening, the way I would describe it, archaeologists have mostly been employed doing work on the surface, helping federal agencies, state agencies, tribal agencies manage the resources that are on the ground, and not, honestly carrying around a shovel ready to dig things up. It's more about identifying those places of concern and interest. And then if it's in the context of development, finding a way to protect those places, and as we've talked, for more than a decade now, with Chaco as an example, finding a way to protect those sites and landscapes, but allow then responsible development to happen. So that really is more than half, I think, of what's happening sort of in the archaeological and cultural realm these days.
Right. And looking at these jobs again, as we mentioned, there's not a lot of them across the country. That would say to me that maybe there's some bigger competition for openings when they occur. Would you agree with that? If someone was thinking about getting into the field, is that something they should be aware of and just know that going into it?
No, I think there's a lot of jobs, and this is kind of a nationwide trend as we think about still 2, 3, 4 years here emerging out of COVID and all the disruptions there. I think there's plenty of jobs if folks want to work in archaeology. In fact, talking to my friends who work in, BLM, Forest Service, Park Service type settings, they typically hire seasonal archaeologists to help with different projects that they're trying to accomplish during, the nicer times of the year. And a lot of times they'll put out advertisements and they don't get, even a good pool of candidates to select from. So, and I think there's definitely different factors that could come into play there. But at this point, if you want to do work as an archaeologist, get out in the field, and again, doing primarily surface work, mapping work, GPS, GIS, management type work of that sort, there are lots of jobs at this point. If you want to take a more academic route, the competition for those is very, very serious. So, it's, but, if you want to become an archaeologist, you get a bachelor's from any accredited university in the U.S., and you're at that point, if you've done some field work, typically a field school, you're ready to go into the field and begin to learn how, what we call the World Cultural Resource Management, or CRM, how that works. So, there's definitely a lot of job potential there.
Gotcha. Very good. And we've talked before too about how some of these different federal regulations and state rules employs archaeologists or folks working in archaeology. If there's a road project or a construction project, a lot of times there's a study that needs to be done or a site study, right, of this proposed construction site for whatever it is that we're talking about, and that gives jobs to archaeologists as well in that area. Correct?
Definitely. If there's any development countrywide involving federal lands, federal funds, and for a lot of the states, either state land or state funds, then developers will start talking to officials, either at BLM, Forest Service, whatever agency, and potentially with folks at the state level. Each of our states has a state historic preservation officer, an SHPO or SHPO, for short. So they'll begin those consultations, discussions. At this point, then they're also going to start talking to tribes and say, are there concerns? And, that final piece is one, of course, that we've talked a lot about. And I think that we definitely need to push that and continue to have that be a very important priority. But basically, if you want to build something on federal lands, you have to treat it very differently in 2024 than you might have 20 years ago, 40 years ago. And, there are complaints, of course, that come about. But, the country has expanded tremendously. Our population has increased by over 100 million people in that 40 years. And, the resource base, the archaeological sites, the historic sites, the cultural sites on the landscape, have been impacted through these different projects. So what we do in the planning realm, in the cultural resource management realm, is we work from the beginning if the developers, have this on their radar, and we help them plan very carefully how to build things, again, without impacting, the irreplaceable cultural resources and landscapes that we have out in our world.
Right. Very true. And talk to me more about the connection with the Native American tribes, the indigenous groups, and things like that. That's another relatively new development in the field of archaeology, getting more input from these groups. If I'm a student, maybe a Native American or indigenous student who wants to get into archaeology, I would think that archaeology firms would want to hire me for my insights and my cultural knowledge to help guide some of these things, or at least be there in the room as they're being talked about. Is that kind of where things are going?
Yeah, it definitely is, Scott. And I'm glad to say that for the length of my career, this has been a concern and has been on the radar. My initial work, right when I got out of graduate school, I was hired by the Navajo Nation Archaeology Department and stationed to work in Farmington. Just a short, I don't know if I can count that high, not quite 40 years ago.
Right.
And so I was basically an outsider, but brought in by the tribe to work with a team of mostly Navajo tribal members and some other folks who had training. And we were helping the Navajo Nation to manage the cultural resources on the reservation. And so for me, that was an amazing opportunity to learn how to do the management of cultural resources, how to work with tribal members, and how to do that in a respectful way. So Navajo Nation was out very early on that front. The Pueblo of Zuni has had a very active cultural program since the early 1980s, at about the same time that the Navajo Nation developed theirs. Hopi has a very active program to manage their own resources. So what we're seeing now after the 40 years of that is more and more tribes beginning to do that. But bringing up the student, what you said about young Native American students going into the field, that really has always been, I think, one of the challenges is that it is somewhat difficult with archaeology's bad legacy. Let's be honest about that, with many tribal members believing that archaeologists have primarily gone into communities and removed artifacts and individuals and then not returned them in the way that they should have, or not excavated them in the first place. I think there's a great deal of barriers. There's quite a few barriers to young tribal members being encouraged to do cultural work. But, there are nonetheless folks who do that. We do a lot of work with tribes saying, these are good careers. Archaeologists don't excavate that much anymore. If we do, it's done in a very respectful way. So I think that's part of that sort of decolonization process, if that makes sense. And when the tribes are in control of their own lands, which, all of our groups in New Mexico have their own cultural programs, in many cases have their tribal historic preservation officers who have the authority to decide, how to do work with their own heritage on their own lands, that's huge. Now, a lot of the work that I've done in Archaeology Southwest has done is to help tribes, extend that beyond their own borders out to areas where there are public lands, but where they have ancestral sites. So, there's kind of different fronts going on. I would say that we need to get more young Native folks into programs who are interested in cultural work, to basically staff up and increase the capacity for groups. The other thing that we've done now for more than a decade is said to archaeologists, well, if you're going to try and do a project that might be more in the realm of, pure research, talk to some tribes and see if there's some involvement, see what their interests are. And I think that's been real positive, but we still have the capacity issue on the tribal side. So, there's a couple different things there, and we just want to continue to work on that and try to get more young people into programs so that they can, look at these careers and see if it's something that they're interested in doing.
Sure. Very good. And of course, we're talking about this from a perspective of being here in New Mexico. Other states may be a little bit different. Do you have any insights, Paul Reed, on the situations maybe in other states with larger indigenous populations, our neighbors in maybe Arizona, maybe the Dakotas and places like that? Are some of these things happening hopefully nationwide, or are we ahead of the curve a little bit here in our state?
Yeah, I think New Mexico and the Southwest in general really is ahead of that curve. Arizona has a number of tribes who have their own historic preservation offices, and there are nationwide. But they have, I think, many more tribal members engaged in cultural work. I mean, Utah, to some extent, with the groups there, and the Ute tribes in Colorado definitely, have a very active role in managing their own lands. If we get up to Oklahoma, of course, many indigenous groups there, as they were displaced from the east. There's very active programs in Oklahoma with tribes managing their own lands and having strong roles. So I think in the West, things can always get better, but I think there is, very active management of tribal cultural resources. As we go east, perhaps a little less. But, we sort of have a long tradition in New Mexico and in the Southwest of groups being on the landscape in the places where they were aboriginally, by and large. So I think we just have a lot more momentum in this area. But, there are conferences every year that bring different tribal members together. They have a big tribal historic preservation conference every year that brings in the professionals working to manage resources on tribal lands together to, work out the best solutions to those situations. So, as we've talked a lot, Scott, I think we're in a real exciting time in terms of making this transition and really having tribes have a much more active role on their own lands and on adjacent public lands in managing their heritage, which, is one of those things when I talk to people who are outside the field, sometimes, they're kind of like, well, yeah, how come this hasn't been the case for years and decades? And, again, it's this legacy and this problem that we're trying to work through.
Sure. Well, and again, in your career, as you look back over the 40 plus years and can see some of the changes, some of the innovations, maybe some of the new thought going into, working more with indigenous groups and getting more of their input into the work that you are doing. I'm sure a lot of folks feel that way, but maybe not everybody. And so as those folks maybe leave the profession and newer folks come in, is that something that you're encouraged that maybe there'll be this more of a trend for openness and working more with these indigenous groups as time goes forward?
Yeah, definitely, Scott. And I see that really just with, my younger friends and colleagues who've gone through graduate school since about 2000, 2005, 2010, et cetera, that they've had a much different, more diverse training in their programs, both undergrad and graduates. And they're really, just to turn the phrase, getting it from my perspective, and I think from other people's perspectives, that, archaeology is in this big transition. And to their credit, a lot of, my slightly younger colleagues and friends really want to be part of that process. And they want to have a positive impact on it, and then there are folks, young and old, who may feel like the way we've done archaeology for decades and or centuries, doesn't necessarily need that big of effect. So I think, as with everything, there's a diversity of opinion, and, it's important to hear the different sides and figure out the best way forward. But from my perspective, we have a lot of momentum in this change and this evolution and this process. And, what I intend to do with the time that I have is to continue to be an active part of this and support my tribal friends and colleagues and really figure out the best way to have, again, that understanding, that management of tribal heritage and cultural resources be one of the primary things that we do, both at Archaeology Southwest and I do in my own life.
Right. Well, and I know there's a lot of groups and folks that you have worked with who are very appreciative of that relationship and to continue to work with you and the organization that you work for. Again, Archaeology Southwest, you have shared with us on this program some of the many innovative programs and things that the organization does in its work as well as a nonprofit that tries to do good in these communities and things along that line. So I think a lot of it is going into some of these organizations and some of their mission and policies, right, as they work with these groups and in these very sensitive areas.
Right, exactly. And as with any field, there's a great deal of momentum and sort of inertia from the way things have, quote, always been done, whatever timeline we're talking about there. And that has been the case with the way, particularly at the federal level, archaeology programs, cultural programs are pursued. But with the work that we've been doing, with Petroglyph National Monument, certainly work with Chaco and Aztec, Malpais National Monument, some other projects. We're just starting a project at Bandelier that I'll talk to you about at some point next year. I've seen a lot of positive change at the federal agency level as well, with really a much deeper understanding that if they're working in the West and they're managing indigenous cultural resources and certainly some Euro-American historic resources and potentially other diverse groups, but if they're primarily managing indigenous Native American sites, then the involvement of the tribes who are the descendant groups is critical in that effort. And again, this seems, like such an obvious thing, but we've gone through decades of doing American archaeology and cultural work without having, in my mind, anywhere near sufficient involvement of the tribes. So again, it's time, and this is a great process we're in.
Very true. Very true. Well, Paul, I'm afraid to say that we are out of time, as this is what happens to us when we get together and talk about any topic, it seems, in the archaeology field. But it's been fascinating. Again, thank you for coming on the program. I'm a little relieved to hear you talk about wanting to be on the show in a year to talk about a project, so that makes me less fearful about the R word. So I appreciate you bringing that up as well.
Well, I think there's a future here.
True. I do too. Great. Paul, thanks so much for being with me, and we'll talk to you again in about a month.
Thanks, Scott.
Take care. That's Paul Reed, of course, with Archaeology Southwest. As I mentioned, he's done a lot of work with Salmon Ruins and Chaco Canyon, of course, and the Aztec ruins, and a lot of work throughout the region. My guest here on KSJE this morning. KSJE and the San Juan College Native American Center present the Student Study Tip of the Week.
My name is Emin Chi, Achievement Coach with the Native American Center, and we're bringing you coaching tips of the week. Plan ahead. Create a study plan at the beginning of the semester based on your course syllabus. Ideally, you should study a little bit every day throughout the week. Even just 20 minutes can make a huge difference, so you don't wind up cramming and stressing right before the big exam.
The Student Study Tip of the Week is presented by the San Juan College Native American Center and KSJE.